Welcome to session 5 of the webinar series on challenges, lessons, and innovations for integrated flood risk management. This is an event organized as part of the Asian Development Bank's Knowledge Support and Technical Assistance Project, Strengthening Integrated Flood Risk Management. I'm Lorena Ramirez, Senior Water Specialist from London Mills and Project Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's session. Before we start, I would like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, and also that there are 2 language channels providing simultaneous interpretation to Bahasa and Vietnamese. Next slide, please. Today's session will be a 90-minute panel discussion on the key issues on integrated flood risk management. This is the final session of a 5-part webinar series, which concludes the Knowledge Support and Technical Assistance Project, Strengthening Integrated Flood Risk Management, funded by the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. I would like to open this session by inviting Yasmin Siddiqui for opening remarks. Yasmin Siddiqui is a chartered civil engineer and has a postgraduate degree in irrigation engineering. She has over 25 years of experience in natural resources management, including integrated water resources management, irrigation, knowledge solutions, and leading teams at the Asian Development Bank. Yasmin is currently the operational director for agriculture and natural resources in the Central and West Asia Department of ADB. Over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you very much, Lorena, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined on this call. I think this has been an excellent series, and I'm very honored to be sharing some remarks in this final event. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, which has provided $3 million in funding the technical assistance for strengthening integrated flood risk management. It's also supported 11 projects in 7 of ADB's developing member countries, mainly by supporting project preparation of coastal and riverine integrated flood risk management projects. So a very big thank you to the UCCRTF fund, but also the team that works very closely with the operational project officers and across the bank to ensure that that trust fund is being utilized to its maximum. Well, as we all know, that flood risk management is perhaps a relatively, I would say, modest, but increasingly important component of ADB's water portfolio. Often we hear about floods usually on the end of a disaster or an event that's occurred, where there'll be emergency responses and emergency support. What's important is how we work more comprehensively, systematically, and preemptively to support flood risk management in our developing member countries. ADB estimates that developing Asia will need to invest about $26 trillion from 2016 to 2030, or the equivalent of about 1.7 trillion per year. So the numbers are quite mind-boggling in scale. This is if the region is to maintain its growth momentum, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. Of the total climate-adjusted investment needs over 2016 to 2030, the water sector as a whole needs a total of about $3 trillion or about $198 million per year. And this comes from the OECD and Asian Water Development Outlook 2021 estimates. So the scale is huge, the need is enormous. And if we look at climate change, well, even without climate change, most regions have already required a significant investment for flood risk management. And to build climate change resilience into the sector will require additional investments in water resources development, coastal, riverine, and urban flood risk mitigation measures to minimize those impacts on water infrastructure, but importantly, to minimize those impacts on people and their assets. The World Bank has estimated that with less than 0.5% of GDP, adaptation could remove around 70% of climate change damages by the end of the century, at a cost that would leave net damages reduced. Similarly, the Global Commission on Adaptation has estimated that investing about 1.5 trillion euros in early warning systems, resilient infrastructure, improved dryland agriculture and crop production, protected mangroves and resilient water resources could create close to 6 trillion euros worth of benefits. So by doing a small investment, we can see large benefits and returns on that investment. Of course, the investment requirement is large. In 2021, ADB elevated its ambition to deliver climate financing to over 100 billion from the period 2019 to 2030. And our president has taken a very clear direction on achieving this target and delivering on it, with 66 billion for climate mitigation financing and 34 billion for scaling up transformative adaptation projects and enhanced resilience. So flood risk management projects will play an increasingly important role in allowing ADB to reach that target. In terms of economic analysis, the main benefits of flood risk management projects arise from future damages being avoided, and floods come in all magnitudes. The benefits in terms of damages avoided require a unique type of economic analysis, which looks at the full range of return periods. It requires quite specialist support in hydrological and hydraulic modeling and in economic analysis. But a project that's been properly designed can introduce additional benefits, such as natural capital and other regional public goods, for example, mangroves. These benefits are not easy to quantify, of course, and these benefits are not well tuned to the private sector, and consequently, flood risk management projects are often very much segregated into public sector financing. So what about the private sector? So often it's not economically feasible to provide flood protection against all events. There will also be some residual risk. And this is where the private sector, through the insurance and reinsurance industry, can come into a flood risk management project by insuring against these residual risks. I often say that within ADB and beyond that, within our developing member countries, it's not just one player that provides the solution. It's the collaboration of multiple players. And as we've just heard, it's about public sector, private sector partnerships, about specializations, about financing support, such as UCCRTF, which culminates in that deliverable. So again, very warm welcome to you all, and I look forward to a very interesting and invigorating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasmin, for your words. Next, I would like to introduce Ian Wood, who is the team leader and climate change specialist to the Knowledge Support and Technical Assistance Project on Strengthening Integrated Flood Risk Management. Ian Wood has over 35 years of experience working in water resources and flood management sectors, and over half of the experience has been in Southeast Asia. Through working on projects with donor agencies, Ian can offer some insights on the many practical aspects for implementing flood risk and disaster management programs. Ian will be facilitating the panel discussion today. Thank you, Ian.
And thank you, Ms. Siddiqui, for the introductory remarks, and welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce you all to some very well qualified experts in the field of flood risk management for this discussion today. So I'll just briefly run through the agenda so that we know where we're going. We've heard an introduction. I'll provide a brief overview of the KSTO project and the introduction to our experts. And then there'll just be a short presentation from me, just some reflections on issues for IFRM, just to give us some context to our discussion. But really, that's just the preamble, that's the overture. The main show is the panel discussion on IFRM. And so at this point, I'll be initially directing some questions to our panelists based on some discussions that we've had with ADB and other colleagues as well. But then also we'll be, more importantly, opening up the discussions for you, the audience. And so we look forward to receiving your questions. And so please use the Q&A box. You can start writing questions now if you want, or anytime you think about it, you can write a question here. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can with the panel. Halfway through, we're just going to break things up a little bit. We'll be inviting Mr. Verinder Sharma, Principal Urban Development Specialist and ADB Program Manager for the UCC RTF, just to say a few words, a bit of background on that trust fund. We'll continue with our panel discussions, and then we'll receive some closing remarks from Mr. Lance Gore. Okay, so the project itself, just a brief introduction. So it's a KSTA, a knowledge support technical assistance called Strengthening Integrated Flood Risk Management with the ADB. We commenced in February of 2019, and we'll be concluding in a couple of months' time in June of this year. The scope of the project is 8 countries. So it's Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And the various parties and the logos at the top here. So Landell Mills and JBA are the implementing consultants contracted to ADB, of course. And the UCC RTF is the trust fund, which supports the overall project. And it in turn receives funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as the governments of Switzerland and the UK. Just where are we now? So this is number 5 out of 5 webinars that we've been hosting over the past few weeks. We started in March with a country scale view on IFRM, looking at the bigger scale issues, comparing across different countries, making some observations on that, as well as presenting some work that we looked at in using global data sets specifically to look at flood risk management issues across nations. And particularly we were looking at Nepal, Indonesia, and Pakistan. The second one, we went down a level. We're looking more at the river-based level and IFRM in general. And then also we've had presentations on coastal flood risk assessment, economics and finance for IFRM. So now, at the conclusion of all of that, what we're doing now is a panel session. So if you imagine yourselves at a workshop or a large conference event, there's 8 panelists sitting in front of you on the stage, and they've each got a microphone, and we're taking questions from the audience. And so that's how we're approaching this final webinar. So just a few words on before we get to the introduction to our panelists. The themes that we've chosen for this presentation is about challenges, lessons, and innovations. So challenges, we know that flood risk management is not easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having flooding problems. So therefore, what are the challenges and how can we address them? Secondly, we've been doing this for a long time. There's a lot of lessons that we've learned, and we'd like to use this opportunity to talk about those lessons and to see what we can share between the different countries that are involved in this project, and also with our colleagues at ADB who have a variety of experiences to be able to bring to this. And thirdly, innovations. We want to look forward. What's the future? Where the solution's going to come? Is it in technology? Is it in planning? Is it in capacity? Where are the solutions and innovations going to come for IFRM? So when we get into our discussions, bear in mind those 3 issues as well when you're thinking about questions to be asking. At this point, I would like to introduce our panelists. So what I would like to do is rather than hear from me, is to hear in turn from each of our 8 panelists, just to give yourselves a brief introduction about who you are, your position, title, where you work, and what country you're from, and just a few extra words. So in less than 30 seconds, if you could give a brief introduction. So perhaps if I could just remind everybody to unmute their microphone before we start. This is always a problem. So perhaps if I could start with Ms. Dolores Mayo Hipólito in the Philippines. Ms. Dolores, could you say a few words about yourself, and then we'll pass directly to Mr. Ahmed Kamal.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here to discuss flood risk management challenges and innovations here. I've been working on river basin master planning and feasibility study for flood risk management. Although I would admit that at the start, it has been focused on flood control, but then the Philippines has certain policies wherein it has evolved into flood mitigation, then now flood risk management. Actually, our DRRM law includes risk reduction, but we are still going there in how to approach our flood management in the country. So again, good day and hope to have a fruitful discussion with everyone.
Very much. Mr. Ahmed Kamal.
Good afternoon and good evening to all my dear fellows sitting on the other side. This is Ahmed Kamal. Presently, I'm working as Chief Engineering Advisor to the government and Chairman of the Federal Flood Commission. This is my 32nd year in the field of water resource management and flood control. I'm a civil engineer and have my specialization in hydrology and environmental management. I have a number of plans implemented with regard to the national capacity development. I had services given in the National Disaster Management Authority as a member disaster risk reduction, developed National Disaster Management Plan, National Flood Protection Plan 4, and I have been to a number of key positions. Now presently my task is to implement the National Flood Protection Plan 4 under the overall ambit of national water policy. I thank you.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us. I am Sultan Ahmed. By training, I am a civil engineer and a master's and PhD in water resources development engineering. I am a civil servant. I worked for the government of Bangladesh for about 32 years. I worked at the Ministry of Water Resources for about 8 years, and then worked for the Department of Environment for about 7.5 years. I was involved in the preparation of National Water Management Plan, National Water Resources Database, National Water Policy, Coastal Zone Policy of Bangladesh, and then National Environment Policy while I was working at the Department of Environment. I was also involved in the preparation of Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, a 100-year-long plan. You know, Bangladesh is a country of delta. About 80% of the country is being prepared by the deposition of alluvial deposits from the rivers, mighty rivers, Meghna, Jamuna, Brahmaputra, and Ganges. I worked at Capital City Development Authority, and there we prepared a detailed area plan for the city of Dhaka, capital city of Dhaka. And presently, I am retired, and I worked as a secretary for Power Division, Ministry of Power, Energy, and Mineral Resources. And presently, I am working with some universities and also the World Bank as a short-term consultant. Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. Abdul Malik, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Ian. My name is Abdul Malik from National Development Planning Agency in Indonesia. I hold civil engineering degrees, and when working in water sector more than 10 years, most of my job is to prepare and manage and finance national project in water resources, including flood risk management, and also with working with the donor agency for some international aid project, such as now is ongoing the flood management in selected river basin with the Asian Development Bank, and the prepare North Java program with Asian Development Bank. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Abdul. Dr. Ha, can we hear from you, please? Ha, we don't hear you yet.
Sorry, I was moved.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lê Thị Châu Hà. From Vietnam. I work in a disaster field for more than 20 years, and especially on the disaster risk assessment. Currently, I'm working as a consultant. My last with the VNDMA, with the Vietnam Authority of the Disaster Management. And I have experience in working in some project that related to the integrated flood risk management planning, and so the disaster management plan for different regions in Vietnam. And today I'm happy to share with you some of my experience and some information that I can get from my colleagues with you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Ha. Jeff Wilson, you're the next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and good day to everybody. My name is Jeff Wilson. I'm a senior water resources specialist with ADB. I have 30 years of flood risk management experience in the consulting area, and I am team leader for this technical assistance. I'm a hydraulic engineer, and I work with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB. Thank you.
Jeff. Ms. Serena Novikova, can you introduce her, please?
Thank you, Ian, and hello, everyone. I'm Irina Novikova. I'm originally from Kazakhstan. I am with ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, similar to Jeff, and I work on social safeguards, and I'm mapped in ADB. I'm mapped to the safeguards unit, working on various issues related to safeguards implementation in ADB. My particular area is involuntary resettlement and indigenous people safeguards, but also social development issues brought in the broader context. Thank you, and very nice to be here. Back to you, Ian. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Eric, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Jan. Hello, everyone. Eric Kansio, water resources specialist at ADB. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia, working very closely with Pak Abdul, our colleagues from the planning agencies, and I'm leading the Agriculture Natural Resources Program in Indonesia, which is highly dominated by water resources and, as Pak Abdul mentioned, by flood risk management. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I'll just thank you to our panelists for the introduction. I'll just briefly run through about 10 slides just to give us some context and background before we get into the discussion. So prior to this event, I went through the MDAT database, which is a database of disasters across the world, and just pull out some large events from our selected countries, and just to make some initial comparisons and contrasts. So what we can see is that some of these events, I mean, they're obviously very significant. In Bangladesh in 1970, it was a cyclone and storm surge event, a cyclone that caused tremendous amounts of deaths, 300,000 deaths, and about $570 million worth of damage in today's dollars, that is. And so if we can compare that comes up as the largest event in the region since 1970. And we're not including things like tsunami events in this as well. In India, there was river flooding in Jammu and Kashmir in 2014 with not as many deaths, but significant economic losses. Myanmar, also another typhoon cyclone event in 2008. Nagas brought nearly 140,000 deaths and substantial economic losses. In the Philippines, the largest event that comes up is the 2013 Typhoon Haiyan incident, which again was a storm surge event. So the top three of their top four relate to storm surge as causing significant deaths and significant damages. In Pakistan, perhaps the largest one in recent history has been the Indus Valley flood of 2010, again causing substantial numbers of deaths and lots of damage. But not shown in these figures is the hardship and disadvantage that it caused to millions of people along the whole Indus Valley in that flooding event. Just by contrast, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Nepal, the largest events on records are kind of smaller than comparison with these other ones, but that's not to diminish their importance in either of these countries. It's just that we're in a region where we're looking at some countries which have these global vast scale events. If we then consider some of the statistics that we know about these countries, and this is repeating some of the information that we learned in our first webinar, we can look at compare the natural area of floodplain up to a 1% event. And what we see is that Pakistan and India are perhaps the two largest areas of floodplain, natural floodplain. But when we compare it with the percentage of the total country, we see that Bangladesh stands out as about 45% of the total country is exposed in a floodplain event. Whereas in the other countries, Philippines, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, it's around about 15 to 20% of the total country being exposed. Nepal is a smaller country and it's a slightly different set of issues as well. And then if we look at the population being affected the three standout countries here in terms of population and living in the floodplain are Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indonesia, with about more than 60 million people. But the other countries, Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, there are about 30 to 40 million people affected, which is still a large area of population within the floodplain. And again, the percentage of the total nation is around about this 25 to 40% affected. Nepal is slightly different, but it has its own special issues. I wanted to then also just talk about some trends, and we talked about this in webinar 1, but this is an important backdrop to the rest of the discussion. There's two basic trends across disasters worldwide. One is that over time, deaths are decreasing. This is decades across this scale here, and the number of deaths from different kinds of disasters. And what we see is that over time, the number of people dying in disasters is decreasing, but at the same time, the costs, the economic impact of disasters is increasing all of the time. So what does this tell us? This tells us that perhaps we're getting better at forecasting, warning, and responding to flooding, therefore reducing the number of deaths. But at the same time, there's more assets, there's more economic developments, there's more things being flooded, and therefore our economic costs are increasing. So this lies at the heart of what we need to do for integrated flood risk management. Climate change, of course, is an important issue. And during one of our webinars, we asked this question: how much more will it cost to ensure our urban infrastructure is low carbon and climate resilient? And we had a range of questions. This is just poll answers from our own webinar. And we had answers from 5% up to 100% increase. And we compare that with World Bank estimates of around about 9 to 27% is the number, which is the increase required to make our infrastructure more low carbon and carbon resilient. So it's in this zone here, sort of 10 to 30% impact from climate change that needs to be taken into account in our investment. We also then asked this question: how should a government prioritize investment within a country? And this is, again, poll questions. We asked, the options were the funding that gets allocated goes towards the highest or the most recent flood. And that often, we see that often, and there's a lot of logic to that as well. But I mean, by far the number of respondents that indicated the most was relation to that funding was assigned based on a top-down process according to a detailed risk assessment. And the other answers were related to whether funding should be a bottom-up process based on grassroots needs. And then an answer that was also put out there was funding is kind of a political process. It's not always transparent. I guess we're being a bit facetious, a bit joking there, but it's also true that politics has an influence in funding as well. So what is the issues for prioritization then? Well, to be able to conduct a top-down process, we need to have the organization and the institutions geared for it properly. We need to have information on risks and impacts. And that's where a lot of tools and technology is coming in that we've talked about previously in webinars: use of GIS information, remote sensing information, global data sets are also influencing this ability to be able to do this top-down planning. So then what are we going to prioritize? What are the big issues that we need to prioritize? And so we can talk about flood risk, and this is a common way to frame this. Flood risk is a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Hazard is the flood itself. It's the river or the flash flood and storm surge, etc., that influences properties. The exposure are the things, it's the houses, it's the assets, the facilities, or the agriculture, which is at risk. And finally, the vulnerability is all about the people. It's the readiness, it's the awareness, it's the ability for people to be able to cope. So in prioritizing our investments for IFRM, we need to think about all of these three components. And so what do we do? What are the flood risk management measures that we need to think about? So preventing the flood, which is hazard, it's the usual infrastructure type things that we see. It's dams, dikes, drainage works, channels, and so on. When it comes to preventing the disaster or reducing exposure and vulnerability, exposure is all about planning. If we can manage our urban planning, our building development controls, can we relocate our assets, will reduce our exposure. And vulnerability is very much a community and people-focused issues. It's issues for awareness raising, forecasting, warning, flood response. Insurance provides access to funds for post-event recovery and other support facilities for recovery. And we can talk a little bit more about urban development and the issues that are facing there, because that's driving a lot of what's happening in this region. Urbanization is increasing. There are more things and more people and more things at risk every year. And this is particularly true in the countries that we're dealing with, as urbanization rates are increasing dramatically. And not only that, cities are spreading. The style of development is changing. So there's a tendency for cities to spread more. There's an urban sprawl, which is changing the runoff characteristics and the natural drainage capacity in our cities. Secondary cities are growing, and so they're becoming a critical issue as well. And traditionally, many secondary cities in the region, they have limited capacity. They don't have access to the universities and the quality of professional people that you might find in the larger capital cities. And so therefore there are unique challenges for secondary cities. So how do we prioritize which secondary cities to address? Exposure is rising. This includes informal settlements, and this is the case in many cities throughout Asia. And so can we prevent development in high-risk areas, or do we need to relocate vulnerable populations? Are some key issues. Not only that, assets are soaring. So 90% of the capital in urban land is in buildings. So therefore, there is an argument to say, forget everything else. We should be concentrating our resources on protecting these urban areas from flooding, to protect these high-value assets. And that's a controversial issue as well. So we need to get this balance between people and assets and vulnerability and exposure. And finally, markets are shaping. So Yasmin mentioned already about the private sector. There's a clear role for private sector in here. So can private sector be persuaded to champion flood resilience and urban development? And so is urban planning the solution? Well, in theory, yes. Land use planning is fundamental for efficient urban development, and it must be a risk-based approach, which sounds very good if you're dealing with a blank piece of paper and you're able to do your planning from scratch. But in reality, everything is complex. Cities are developed, there's a lot of legacy issues, a lot of history. And so solutions that we provide in terms of planning need to be very practical, because there are many obstacles. And not only that, the third point is that plans, you can create the best plan in the world, of course, but if there's no implementation of that plan or no enforcement of that plan, well, then that's planning is just a piece of paper. So they're important issues as well. And finally, urban planning is more than just plans. It's a pathway to recast how we see our cities and towns. How we want the future is fundamental to how we do our planning. So therefore, they provide us with the opportunity for promoting nature-based solutions or green infrastructure and the concepts of sponge cities. And so therefore, plans need to be harmonious with a greener and more resilient and more livable future in our cities. A couple more slides just on some of these big picture issues that we'll get to in the discussions. Coastal flooding. In the third seminar we talked a lot about coastal flooding, and it is in many respects a seemingly unsolvable problem that with the inevitability of sea level rise and the populations and the development that is occurring in our coasts, there's a great challenge for our future. We saw already that the three largest events in this region were related to coastal flooding issues. And so coastal flooding in their extreme are probably very rare, but they become certainly some of the most important issues for flooding and controlling it. And finally, is nature-based solution. There's a lot of discussion these days about nature-based solutions as providing the way forward in terms of meeting risks and uncertainty. Nature-based solutions perhaps are more cost efficient. They may have issues with maintenance, but then they're inherently flexible and they're inherently sustainable and provide a lot of co-benefits as well. So there are key issues that need to be addressed and discussed when we come to the flood risk management. So that was my overview and that was my brief spiel. I'd like then to start our panel discussion. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to start with Bangladesh and the floods of 1970, the big storm surge event then and the tremendous loss of life that has occurred. But what we know about Bangladesh is that that was 1970 and a similar event of loss of life hasn't occurred again. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Sultan Ahmed about that. So this change that has occurred in Bangladesh, what have been the main lessons learned from the past history of flooding that have been applied, and what are the good news stories that we don't really hear about because we're not hearing about flooding in Bangladesh? What are the real lessons learned that are useful to talk about in this forum? Dr. Sultan Ahmed?
Thank you, Jan, for your good presentation and for asking me about how we worked with flooding in Bangladesh since. Just to inform you that I am physically a survivor of 70 cyclone from Bangladesh. I am from the coastal zone, and about 300,000 people died during the catastrophe. And then after that, in 1991, there is another pre-monsoon flooding in the eastern part of Bangladesh, which has took around 130,000 people in 1991 April. Bangladesh is a country of water. Bangladesh is a country of flood. Bangladesh is a delta country. And from 60s, we have flood control, drainage and irrigation projects all over the country. And until presently, we have completed about 1,000 flood control, drainage and irrigation projects all over the country. And we have polders in the coastal zone. We have about 129 polders in the coastal areas of Bangladesh. Definitely, these flood control, drainage, and irrigation interventions protected human, their settlements, and also their livelihood from agriculture. And in many areas, there were no agriculture before the flood control, drainage, irrigation project has been taken. And the food production increases to 40 million tons per year. And this is mostly because of the flood control, drainage and irrigation of the country. But again, country is always prone to flood because of the mighty rivers flowing through the country. We have more than 400 rivers, and mighty rivers are Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna systems passing through the country and draining out to the Bay of Bengal. And every year we have flooding, we have river erosion, we have siltation sort of thing. I would say that these flood control, drainage, irrigation project created a lot of safety in the mind of people. And then people went to the floodplain for their settlement and also for investment in agriculture and other things. But I would say that this sense of security that has been put in the minds of the people because of poor operation and maintenance of the project, which is already 50 to 60 years old, now the security is seriously impaired. I think floods are not proof now. Floods are entering into the floodplain. Floods are entering into the paddy fields, the people's housing and everything. So there is always damage in the resources. And what you have said that death has been reduced, that is the reality, but cost has increased because of the poor operation and maintenance of those infrastructure. And we need to reduce, first of all, we need to assess the quality of the infrastructure that can protect flood in the floodplain. And then the assessment will lead us to how we can make reduce the risks of flooding at that. So I think that assessment is very much required, and we can work on that so that we can have our plan how we can rehabilitate our existing infrastructure. We have thousands of infrastructure, thousands of kilometers of embankment along the bank of the river, along the coastal zone, and how we can revitalize those and strengthening those infrastructure so that the benefit of this flood protection people can get. This is one thing. Another point I have seen in our question and answer obviously was asking one thing. Flood protection has physically protected our floodplain, the agricultural land, the settlement, but at the same time, flood protection has caused huge damage in the ecosystem. You see, Bangladesh is a country of river floodplain ecosystem. 80% of the country is a river floodplain ecosystem because of the suppression of the flood, because of the suppression of the flood pulsing that has been coming from the river to the floodplain, that brings a lot of kinetic energy, that brings a lot of sediment, a lot of energy, a lot of biomass, and it is working as a bioprocessor. I mean, the flood is working as a bioprocessor for the floodplain ecosystem services, and so these numerous flood protection and flood proofing project, flood control and drainage project caused serious damage in the ecosystem of the floodplain, and that damage has caused the reduction and declination of ecosystem services. Mostly poor people are based on those ecosystem services. So here I would say that during the flood suppression, during the flood protection, we have to also identify the risks that has brought to the floodplain ecosystem by this flood protection. If we can do that, we have some technologies so that we can allow some water, we can allow some spilling of river to the floodplain so that the floodplain ecosystem, floodplains can be reconnected, re-establish the connectivity between the flood and the floodplain so that the ecosystem of the floodplain can be. This is one thing. Another one, I would say that about the urban flooding.
I'm going to interrupt you there. We've got a lot. Maybe we can come back to that.
Okay.
What your answer has been fantastic. What we've learned so far is that we will get around to some other issues as well. So, but I mean, what you've said is just gold. It's just valuable that the issues there relating to infrastructure, not only to have the infrastructure, but the difficulties that arises with O&M, the burden that creates as well to be able to protect and to provide that security that people come to expect as well. And also damage to ecosystems and the need for ecosystems is vitally important. I'm going to throw now, I would like to throw now to Mr. Ahmed Kamal with the same question. You're following from the 2010 Indus Valley floods. What were some of the lessons learned that have been brought forward and now come into the policy and the thinking and the way flood management is approached these days in Pakistan? Mr. Ahmed?
Thank you very much for your question. Let me share with you that we all know that the 2010 floods had a major impact and 1/5 of the country was underwater. There was about 20.1 million population that was displaced. And the major issue that we encountered was perhaps so much of an evacuation that we needed to make. In the background of this 2010 floods, the major, I think, the lesson learned that we got was how well the communities in the low-lying areas are kept away from the main river embankments and dikes. For that very reason, under our National Flood Protection Plan 4, we got the first ever River Act for the country. And that River Act basically was meant to ensure the right of way of the river. And it now has been, being implemented or being enacted. 2 of the provinces have already enacted them. Over and above to this, in our recent discussions with National Disaster Management Authority, we are also trying to have this act, placed with our national parliament so that we can have our federal sort of a overlook with regard to the encroachments on ground. Second, the most important factor which we found was that there has been so many small rivers, small, you can say, streams and secondary tertiary rivers, which have not been calibrated. There is no measuring instrument on that. So for that very reason, we have got now almost a draft prepared for first ever national master plan for flood telemetry. I think that these two interventions are going to pave a great way with regard to ensuring resilience of the communities living very close to the river system. Apart from that, the third lesson that we have learned was that perhaps there has been and there had been some sort of a parallel in federal government entities, and there is
Ahmed, we've lost you, I'm afraid, but hopefully we get him back because that was valuable. I mean, what we learned about was evacuation, flood response, also the influence that this event had on governance issues and policy, and in fact, the legislation and the law and the planning. So that was, obviously key lessons learned for us. I'd like to ask this same question to the Philippines. And so we talked about this 2013 Tacloban event. And so, Mr. Loris Hipólito, can you talk about what happened and what lessons learned in the Philippines following from the event there in 2013?
Yeah, okay. I would divide my answer into pre-disaster and after disaster, maybe. So during the event, there were already so many warnings. It's just that people had different opinions on what is really a storm surge is and how strong or how it will impact their surroundings, the environment. So that is one. So I would say that we need to have more understanding of the magnitude of the hazard that comes to us. And we have an evacuation plan because we already have evacuation plans for different local government units or communities as part of our disaster risk and reduction management activities. But people are having the option to evacuate. So maybe I would say that in future, the government can consider forced evacuation if it's really, necessary. Because some people, the reason for their deaths, they did not really evacuate, or they stayed at their homes, or they stayed at they have a misconception that some concrete areas may be good for them, but the exposure to the hazard is one. So more on IEC on that. And of course, I would not dwell on the poverty because, as you know, many of the households that have been devastated are actually just made of like materials, and that's because of the poor communities that are in the area. So maybe for the post, I would say that we have experienced, pardon me for borrowing the word, pandemic level of devastation, meaning to say it did not only affect one municipality, several municipalities, provinces, but it affected regions in the Philippines. So it's widespread, such that many government centers have been affected. And it took a long time for us to be able to put back telecommunications in place, even electricity, and there has already been a start of looting in some areas because the food and the the relief did not arrive in time, and partly one of that is because of the limited access to the site. So it has been maybe if disaster happen at such kind of scale, then we could adapt the activities that we have been doing for COVID. Like it should not be the responsibility of the local government units only, but there should be a kind of crisis center or a crisis manager to set the direction for the different activities. So that will start, of course, the rescue and relief are already part of our disaster evacuation plans and disaster management plans. But as I've said, if it is of such scale, then it will require mobilizing other regions, particularly Philippines is comprising of so many islands. And and it might be difficult to put the different rescue and the different relief goods to the areas that have been affected by the disaster. So maybe that's one of the key points that I would like to highlight from Typhoon Haiyan.
Strengthening that response capacity and being, well, that awareness raising of what can happen during a major storm surge event is a really important issue and an important lesson learned. Yeah, thanks for that response. Thanks for your answer. I want to turn to Indonesia and Pak Abdul. One of the issues that is key in this whole process is about funding priority. I mentioned it briefly in our presentation. I'd like to ask you about how does Indonesia, in your experience, approach prioritization of funding? So when it comes to funding for major projects related to flood risk management, perhaps if you could talk to us a bit about the river basin management approach that has been applied in Indonesia, or some of the other innovations and good work that's being done in Indonesia in terms of allocation of funds.
Thank you, Ian. To get funding, so we need to have a lot of support from decision maker and put on many planning or documents that mostly is we are a democracy country, so every 5 years new election and the government will provide set of priorities. So in central government put these priorities in our national development plan, but also to secure some funding that become a kind of resource that ready, that a lot of regional government or central agencies apply that funding. So as a funding agency, that's what we are doing, to secure some resource and policies. But we are aware also in managing our river basin, actually time is evolving. Yeah, when there is a high disaster, the priority, everybody talk about that disaster. But maybe when we're doing the flood resilient, we need to work when there is no disaster. But at the same time, the shifting of priority sometimes happen. Yeah? Like the economical stuff is more important. And since also confirm with your data that millions of people lives in the floodplain area, to build, for instance, the structural approach, it means we will deal with a lot of social issues, and it's not really popular during implementation actually. So that's a challenge. But also we induce how to improve our cooperation with the institution. Since to have successful structural and non-structural approach, we need to mobilize a lot of government agencies, the line ministries and regional government, and also public participatory. So now we try to hold kind of the annual coordination body effort, and to provide some programming, comprehensive programming under the national development planning. It includes improve our regulatory framework, and then to have a better data decision, and technology. But and also to at the end, since we deal also with the livelihood of the people, that trigger the land use change, that lives in the floodplain. A lot of communities, community-based resilience is we are now doing, since to have more support from a lot of people. So that's the tricks maybe Indonesian government now are doing to bring more stakeholder participate in this flood resilient program. Thank you.
Pak Abdul, that's a great answer. So what we learned there is about the need to coordinate between government agencies, the priority setting from central government, but then also when it comes to implementation and design, it's about the community-based issues as well as coping with the social issues. So perhaps I could ask Ms. Ha, Dr. Ha, about this as well. I know how you've had experience with developing integrated disaster risk management plans and integrated flood risk management plans in Vietnam. Perhaps you could talk about some of your experiences with that. How do you hear this voice from the lower level? How do you get this community input to this planning? And then the second part of my question would be about how well are these plans received? I mean, we know it's easy to prepare a plan, but how well does it go when it comes to acceptance and implementation of the plan? What kind of challenges do you see there in Vietnam? You're still on mute, Dr. Ha?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You know that the integrated flood management plan developed, the first development of the integrated flood management plan was conducted in 2010, 2012 in the middle part of Vietnam, is the Hương River of Vietnam. So about the first question about the involvement of the community, for the integrated flood management plan, we look at the disaster. We look at the risk, flood risk assessment in different aspects, the social aspects, also the environment aspect, and also the infrastructures aspects. So after that, we conduct a kind of mitigation measurement to mitigate the risks up to, like, for example, like from up to 2020, 2025, and up to 2030, 35, something like that. And in the measurement plan, we involved different sectors, like construction sector, like transportation sector, to upgrade the system just to prevent the flood for the lower person, or for the floodplain person. And then for the non-structures measurement, we involve the we apply the capacity strengthenings for the communities, and also approve the flood maps for the people. Conduct a kind of training to the local staff who involved in the disaster management. And we applied very for the integrated flood management plan. We already developed the plan for quite a long time ago, more than 20 years. Start from 2010 until now. And with 18 main basins in Vietnam, we could establish about 5 or 6 integrated flood risk management plan. It is the main river in Vietnam, mainly in central part of Vietnam and the highland region, because it is kind of very high flood during the rainy seasons. And we found that some is very success, but some is not. Some till now is in a kind of progress. In the central part of Vietnam, the plan for Hương River Basin is quite successful. People created the plan in 2010, and it was approved in 2012 by the provincial people committee. And in that plan, the plan is quite simple, with the very focusing on the flood risk assessment of the Hương River. And the solution is also very tidy, not include many solutions, you know. And one of the very success solution is using the local materials to build the dike, the river embankment, to protect the river bank with away from the erosion. And it works till now. So they constructed in 2011, and it maintained until now. So it's quite successful for that one. And the plan was one of the other reason of the successful is the central government and also the provincial government spend the finance on the solution. So not only the structured solution, but also the concerns about the non-structured solution. They did a lot of training, especially the training for the provincial level. So to improve the capacities of the provincial officer who works in the disaster management. And also,
thanks for your response. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, but I think, you know, we've got some key messages there. I'm interested. I mean, perhaps this is another day discussion, but natural local materials is interesting. Perhaps that's leading towards the nature-based solutions. The reason why I want to interrupt, sorry, Dr. Har, is that I would actually at this time like to invite Mr. Verinder Sharma. Verinder is the he's from ADB. He's looking after the UCCRTF. So I'd like to introduce him at this point, just to say a few words about the trust fund and the involvement and perhaps the outlook for the future. That would be great. Thank you very much, Verinder. Over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Great. I think I was really enjoying the panel discussion. So I was thinking that, you know, is this the right time for me to come in?
We'll have some more after you come in. So, you know, but
if you have given this slot to me, I thought, you know, I'll just come in and share some of my thoughts as far as this TA is concerned. I think this whole session, you know, that we are looking at in terms of ways forward on IFRM, both the challenges, lessons, and innovations has been really interesting. And the whole series now is, you know, this is the final webinar from that series. I'm actually looking back at this TA when it was approved in 2018 and what it has delivered, what are the results that we have seen. And it's quite impressive in the sense that 9 ADB project officers and 13 projects in 8 of the UCCRTF DNCs, that is the developing member countries, have directly benefited from the IFRM TA inputs, both in the design and implementation of the projects. I think that's one of the key, you know, purpose of TA's technical assistance in ADB, and I think that's been done very well. In addition, 7 sector assessments for countries have been done. And I think this has really educated us, on the different types of flooding, riverine, coastal, tidal, surface water, groundwater, dam breach, and even the glacial lake outburst flooding up in the mountains. In addition to that, I'm, really want to say that the 4 technical notes that have been produced, especially on the integrated flood risk management economics, which is the indirect and tangible losses. This is an area, most of us are struggling, to put the avoided losses, the annual average losses, the presentation that was held in the last webinar. And of course, covering the areas of insurance, and of course, gender and social inclusion, which is upfront as far as the UCCRTF is concerned. Our financing partners are really focused on delivering the benefits on gender and social inclusion. So from a TA perspective, looking at within ADB, I think we have achieved full disbursement of this 3 million by June 2022, after the approval in 2018. And this has happened despite the COVID pandemic and its impact on getting the consultants, working in the DMCs, and other barriers that we face. So a huge effort that's been put in. In terms of takeaways, I think it's important to highlight that, it doesn't end up with this TA. It's a continuation, and the practical guide on IFRM that you have already produced will be used by the ADB project officers, because it's aligned with the ADB project cycle, and of course, working very closely with the DMCs who are represented in this panel also. And specifically, this will be used to address the issues of climate finance and adaptation, which are the strategic priorities for ADB. In addition to that, the high resolution flood maps and the data sets that have been produced as a part of this TA have already been shared with the ADB SPADE platform. And this is something that we will be ready to offer to project officers for the design of the future projects under this. So thanks for this team to actually allow those data sets to be used, both for the ADB project officers as well as the developing member countries. I think a huge thanks to all the technical experts of Landell Mills and JBA, particularly Ian Wood, you as the team leader, I think for the TA implementation and a very successful webinar series. Finally, my last point, I want to highlight the impeccable teamwork and the methodological project management work that has been done by Jeff Wilson under this. I think as the TA project officer in the water sector group, he has worked very closely with Okchu, who has been our UCCRTF focal in delivering this. And we feel that, this 3 million, it's worth spending on this TA in terms of the outputs that we are getting. And I would, my final point is that, this is, I consider it one of the best managed TA amongst all the UCCRTF supported TAs. And we have about 30 to 35 different technical assistants with various ADB divisions and developing. So I think a huge effort by Jeff and Ian on this particular TA, and we would want to ensure that the work that is being done is continued. We are now moving into the second phase of the trust fund, which would be known as the Urban Resilience Trust Fund, and expanding our countries into Pacific also, about 19 countries from the 8 that we had in UCCRTF. And we would like to continue to use the products that have been used, plus ensure that IFRM becomes an integral part of the ADB water sector group and its project planning and implementation. So thank you very much, and sorry for sort of interrupting your panel discussion. So back to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. And it's interesting to hear where the future of the trust fund is going as well towards resilience and climate change. We've got some more time, so I'm going to throw to a couple of our other panelists. Next will be Eric. Eric, yeah, as a project officer with ADB, you've had a lot of experience with both developing new projects as well as implementing projects. Perhaps if you could talk to us about some of the practical issues that you encountered, both in preparing and implementing projects when it comes to working with government in Indonesia. Where are the real challenges? Are the challenges in just getting the infrastructure completed, or are there issues relating to capacity and the softer sides of flood risk management that are more relevant and more challenging?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. And again, I have my colleague Abdul on the call. So, well, definitely when Abdul and I are trying to promote a more comprehensive flood risk management, addressing hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, we are facing institutional challenges, and Indonesia is highly decentralized. Line ministries tend to work in silos. So, and I recognize Abdul, we are putting a lot of efforts in trying to connect the dots, bringing all the partners to be part of the investment. That's not always easy. Also, a large part of the floods are, a main cause for the flood is really about land management, and that's a very touchy issue here in Indonesia, because land is very valuable. Our population is quite dense, especially in Java Island. So it's very difficult to revise spatial plans to do reforestation. It's very challenging because social, economic factors will influence a lot on proposed activities. We are facing, as I said, a silo or institutional architecture, which is very challenging to deal with, and financing. We have to prioritize. We are currently preparing a new investment. It's around. We are looking at potentially $1 billion worth of physical investment. We have a budget of $250 million, so we have to make choice. We have to prioritize investment. We have to sacrifice some of the areas, and that was a discussion you were presented in the slides. Should we put the money in high value assets, or should we protect a larger amount of the people? But also we are facing a dilemma on land, and I think Irena might touch on this later. Availability of land is always an issue when we want to upgrade rivers, build banks, or even Abdul was proposing to actually purchase the land if it is economically more interesting than just building banks. But there is a huge social tension related to this, to deprive people from revenues from agriculture, move villages in some cases. So that all this social tension, which are, how to say, constraining full development, full-scale development of the to implement the IFRM master plan. I'll stop here, and maybe Abdul or Irena wants to add on this.
Thanks, Eric. That's great questions, because it leads directly to Irena. So your experience in ADB. We often talk about, it's easy to talk about things like resettlement and saying, oh, well, the problem is there's too many people in the floodplain. Can we resettle people out of the floodplain? Which comes into these urban planning issues and urban development. So how do, in your experience, how do you cope with this need, on the one hand, to in effect save people by moving them away, but also protect them by giving them their rights and their agency to live in those areas? Irena, that was a question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's a very sensitive question, I would say. I was taking quite a few notes, so I have a few points. First, I think I would like to highlight the importance of community participation, especially when it comes to sort of forced relocation or planning, you know, in relation to future mitigation measures. I think it's really important. And in your slide, you showed 15% of cost based on bottom-up decision making versus 33% of cost decision making made based on top-down assessment. So I think things like community mapping, geomapping, you know, crowdsourcing of information is very critical to actually cross-check that formal modeling that's being done. And I think also Pak Abdul from Indonesia made this very important point that the planning part cannot happen without participation of communities. So similar for land acquisition, when projects are developing a future strategy to land planning, and I think there is also a question on this from Kazuto Suzuki. What does it mean, land use planning? Do we mean land restriction of living in these affected areas, or do we mean just adjustment, bringing in some mitigation measures which allow people to continue living and not lose their livelihoods in the affected areas? I think this is also a very important question. How do we do resettlement in these cases? How do we do planning? So on resettlement, I think there are some new practices that are coming up. If mitigation measure is actually forced displacement, and there is a phased planning approach to relocation of people and communities, then it's quite important first to rely on bottom-up assessments and bottom-up development. And secondly, it's quite important also to look into holistic way of resettling people. And some examples are coming from the application of the graduation approach, which originated in social protection, but it basically looks at resettlement holistically, looking at livelihood restoration, providing counseling, coaching to people, and ensuring that they are connected to the services and livelihood sources in their resettlement places. So that's on that front. I also wanted to mention, given that we talk about land acquisition, is that SPS ADB is currently upgrading and reviewing its safeguards policy statement. And there are quite a few developments that may happen on that front. And first of all is the look into the integrated environmental and social impact assessment that ADB may commit to undertaking. And this is in line with what other MFIs now have in their safeguards requirements. But what this allows us is to look broader at the social impacts at the project context, at the project level, and to see how we can actually incorporate issues related to community safety, you know, emergency preparedness, and sort of flood risks in the project designs. So that's one component. I think the second component is also looking, and we did some benchmarking studies on community safety and health and security, and these provisions are usually housed under the standard 4 for MFIs, and I think we're now discussing on how ADB can provide sort of better guidance and better policy requirements related to community safety. And in this respect, I think there is also a question on ecosystem services. In particular, we want to look at streamlining approach to ecosystem services assessments at the project level. And this relates to assessment on the community's reliance on ecosystem services at the project level, as currently is assessed as part of due diligence for the project, but also looking at potential mitigation measures on ecosystem services as a result of the project impacts. Sort of these broader changes are expected in the safeguards policy for ADB. I'm not an environmental specialist, but I would be happy to connect if people have questions on ecosystem services further. I would be happy to connect to our environmental specialists on this front. And finally, on resettlement, I think one of the items that we would like to consider in the policy update is actually expanding the use, expanding the guidance on the types of transactions that can be used. So forced eviction and sort of forced displacement is highly unpopular. So we would like to provide more guidance on voluntary types of land acquisition, meaning that land can be acquired for projects through through mechanisms such as land pooling, where land leases, or where original title holders or communities may actually retain the right to land, but it's still possible for the government to proceed with having access to those lands that have to be where mitigation measures have to happen. So this expansion of the standard, I would say, on land acquisition would potentially make the approach more flexible in terms of how we can make land available for these kinds of needs. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
A lot of interesting issues there. And it's interesting to particularly hear about some of these, I guess, newer ideas or innovations relating to flexible approaches to land use, and where are the win-win situations that we can provide the flood risk reduction that we require, but without, with sort of sharing the land use as well. So that's interesting to hear about. We've got a question for Jeff at this stage, and I'm going to adapt a question from Manish from our chat box, our Q&A box. Manish was asking about structural interventions, and particularly he was talking about embankments and the risk that it can create a situation where with the embankments you'll end up trapping sediment as well. So and therefore you're providing flood protection, but then also the river itself is changing in terms of its morphology as well. Perhaps the broader issue there for Jeff is what are the trade-offs when you start implementing infrastructure work for river systems in some of these complicated and mobile bed river systems? What are the kind of trade-offs that are required for flood risk management, or what are the technology solutions that we should really be thinking about as well?
Thanks, Ian. There's many parts to responding to such a question. There's embankments are used typically both in developing countries and developed countries. And I think one of the things you need to be aware of is that you cannot design and build an embankment, at least economically, which will cater for all sizes of all floods. So typically you would design them to, let's say, the 50-year or the 100-year flood. That means that there is a possibility, albeit slight, there's a possibility that the embankment will overtop. So the residual risk needs to be examined, and it needs to be examined in terms of what are you protecting behind the embankment. If you're protecting agricultural land, then you're losing that floodplain attenuation storage that you would normally have had. And what you're doing there is you're speeding up the flood and you're pushing the water downstream. If you were to allow the flood to spill onto the floodplain, then you would be attenuating the flood and reducing the flood peak for downstream. So there is a trade-off here in terms of what level of protection you want and the impacts downstream. You also have to remember that embankments fail. There are many places where embankments have failed prior to their level of protection. And so the area that's being protected, and somebody mentioned this earlier today, provides a false sense of security, or maybe not a false sense of security, but a sense of security that the embankment will always save them. That is not the case. Even in developed countries, Japan last year had quite devastating floods, and many of them were due to embankment failure. So, and that happens all the time. You mentioned sedimentation and morphology. The river regime will always be changing when you introduce interventions, and you need to be aware of what those changes are anticipated to be. and sediment and morphology impacts are very difficult to estimate. You could probably estimate the direction which things will move, maybe an order of magnitude, but the details cannot be done with today's science. But it needs to be considered. And I mean, you know, there are so many issues to be concerned with. It kind of, I don't know, gets me to thinking that, or to the understanding that flood risk mitigation projects are not easy to prepare and to implement. There are so many things going on. There's the economics, the benefit cost analysis has to stack up. There's land requirements. Hydraulics, flood mitigation is a balance between conveying the flood downstream and storing the flood. And embankments, as I mentioned, convey the flood downstream instead of storing the flood. But regardless of whether you're storing the flood or conveying the flood, you require land. And normally somebody owns that land. And so you have to deal with whoever owns that land, because the water's got to go somewhere. You know, it cannot just disappear. And then, you know, if you're undertaking some mitigation works like an embankment, maybe you are creating a negative impact to somebody else further downstream. So you need to consider who gets the benefit and who gets the negative impact. And of course, when you're talking about who gets impacted, the environment is also a stakeholder. So the environment may also be impacted. And so you need to consider that during construction, but also after construction. And then what makes things so much more complicated now is that we've got climate change and sea level rise, which is coming into this. And if you bring dams into it, there's another dimension of complexity. And I think, you know, if there's a lesson learned from what I've been doing and working in this field, is that you need to get good technical advice. Good technical advice on the hydrology and the hydraulics, good technical advice on the economics, good technical advice on the environment and social impacts. And what that leads to at the end of the day is that you need a good consultant. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
A lot of interesting points there that yeah, you've really highlighted for us all, and in effect summarize a lot of the discussion that's gone on already, that flooding is a complex issue. It's way more than just the hydraulics and the hydrology. It is about these environment issues, about the people and about the planning and about the future, and then compounded with climate change as an issue. Look, I'm really sorry, but we're running out of time. And as always, we've perhaps been ambitious to try with so many panelists and such a complex and complex set of issues to deal with. So I really want to say thanks to everybody for your participation. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but we are going to have to draw this to a close. And so with some closing remarks, I would like to introduce Mr. Lance Gore, who works as a Principal Water Resources Advisor in the South Asia, Principal Water Resources Specialist in the South Asia Department of ADB. So Lance, would you like to give us some closing remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and hello, everyone. Time is tight, so I won't speak for too long. And I think some summary words have already been shared by Jeff and Verinder on the conclusion of this TA. Look, I'd just like to say thank you to the Urban Climate Change Resilient Trust Fund for providing the funds. Thank you to Verinder for supporting Jeff and his team. Jeff, you've done a great job with this TA, and your team of Landell Mills and JBA have done a fantastic job. You've been working with operation departments, which is where I work. Thank you so much for the panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion. I took some time today to just go back through the previous webinars as well as part of this series, and myself have learned a lot. You know, I started my career in flood management. It's moved on substantially since when I was focused on flood management. Nowadays, I work primarily on irrigation and water scarce areas, and integrated water resources management. And this is where integrated flood management really comes into play, because as we move forward into the future, we have to really realize that floods are going to become the resource of the future, that water scarce areas are not going to get water for most of the year. They're going to have to rely on the floods that come down, and we have to figure out how we manage those floods and how we can utilize them productively. So this is a big challenge for all of us. Great to see that we're taking an integrated approach. It really needs to be taken at a river basin level. All the stakeholders need to be involved. Can't just focus on a single spot. Downstream urban areas need the support of upstream watershed areas. So with that, let's draw this to a close. Thank you very much to everyone who's participated. Thank you for the great discussions. There's a lot more to be done, and let's get on with that work. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
So we need to conclude with there. I'm going to throw back to Lorena just for the concluding remarks for the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ian, for facilitating the discussion, and thank you to all the experts in the panel. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you enjoyed the 5 sessions in the webinar series. And goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Lorena. Thanks, Ian and team.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.